Thank you for tuning in to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 250. How to use real-world cultures without appropriating or outright mimicking.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world?
Do you need more? Does it make sense?
Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination.
This is the place where we will prime your mind.
Now, it's time to heat up the forge.
Break out the mithril ingots and hammer.
Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
Let's sup from the muck of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And distractedly yours, I am Michael Miller.
With he's leveling up his reading skill today as well, too.
What was that? Did you hit the microphone or was that your phone?
I turned my phone on when I missed your text earlier, because I typically leave my sounds off so I don't get distracted while I'm working.
Fair enough.
And I went to turn them on and you had already texted me, so I turned my thing on. Okay, so I'm just going to...
I'll have no excuses, Jeff.
You will have 3.
Fine. I'll have no more than 3 excuses, Jeff.
Yes. So
I draw the line at 3.
Draw the line at 3. That's a fair line to draw.
I do.
Now, this one came up. This is another one of our question episodes. Thanks to Jonathan, who was talking about a specific circumstance, probably directly related to him. But it's this idea of how do you make up a culture, based off of an Earth culture, and not have it look exactly the same, and not have it culturally appropriate. And so it's really kind of 2 questions, but I think we had knocked them out in one episode.
Let's change that wording real quick, because culturally appropriate and appropriating cultures are 2 very different things.
Appropriating, we're talking about.
I know, that's what I'm saying, without appropriating.
What I'm saying is it's really 2 questions. And so I think first you have to kind of cover the cultural appropriation, which if you pay attention at all to the Webernets, it's a very hot topic. It's something that people are going to get offended at if they can recognize anything from Earth in your work. There will probably be someone who gets offended over your work.
See, maybe I'm insensitive, but it's probably
you are.
It's probably truer than I am. I think that if things are done in good nature, I think it should be, given with some grace, because there's a big difference between appropriating a culture and paying homage or showing love for a culture.
Yeah.
I specifically think of a woman, a young girl not too long ago who wore a very Chinese styled dress to her prom. It's a beautiful dress, and the girl just thought it was a really pretty dress, but she put it up on Twitter like, oh, this is my prom dress, and the internet and the world gave her a rash of crap for it. They're like, my culture isn't your prom dress, and she's like, I just think it's a pretty dress, and a bunch of people came to her side and were like, you look great in the dress, don't listen to the haters, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, are we digging a little too deep and scrutinizing a little too much when we're blasting a teenage girl for wearing a dress when she's clearly not trying to do any harm to another culture by wearing a piece of clothing?
I would kind of agree with you. I don't want to spend the whole episode, which we probably could, just talking about the...
Oh, no. We're going on a 2-hour segue on prom dresses, Jeff. I have a whole plan. I have a whole plan for a prom dress segment. There's going to be breakdowns. It's fine. Well, we can do another episode.
But, essentially, the thing I want to put up front is the closer your fantasy culture resembles in the eyes of the readers or the people who interact with your fiction, an actual Earth-like culture, especially one that has traditionally been appropriated, the more likely you are to run into issues. And actually, I learned that you can actually run into actual copyright or trademark issues at times too. The Navajo Nation have actually trademarked their name to try and help it not be used in contexts that they don't like. So just be cognizant that it's something that's very sensitive. And I think there's some really fair reasons, for people to be sensitive about how their cultures are used. And if you're not from the culture that you're taking from, it is in your best respect, and to go through these couple steps that I've kind of thought out here, the first thing is there is no checklist, unfortunately, to help us with this, right? So as a creator, you're inspired by things that you run into in your exploration of life. And in reality, you couldn't get them out of influencing you no matter what you do. But if you try and base a culture off of something that has inspired you, there's no checklist to go by either, which further complicates this. Sort of the rules of thumb I use, and maybe I'm going to try and actually find someone with more experience talking about this than me. But I found a good article on fashion, ironically enough, after what Michael was talking about. Talking about the do's and don'ts of cultural appropriation. There'll be a link in the show notes.
On subject.
On subject, as always. And but the first thing I think is, if you're going to use a bit of a culture, or you're going to try and pull inspiration from a culture, do some actual research to get the best understanding you can of it before you get started. And also be honest and be like, hey, here, this is very much inspired me, and that's kind of where this came from. Pay the homage, like Michael said. If it's out of love, pay the homage to the people who did it. And if you're making money off of it, especially if they're a culture, like many of the Native American cultures, or many Native cultures, whether or not they're in America, many Native peoples a lot of times get appropriated, and they're really dirt poor. Find some way to maybe pay it back, a little bit, of your proceeds or something like that. I think it would make you stand out from most people. If they're a culture that's like rich, you still have to pay homage, I think, and you should always do that no matter what your influences are. Or don't be like, hey, this is the completely original thing I thought of, and have it, Native Romans on Mars. People are going to see through that.
And if you can't help out the culture that you're paying homage to monetarily, then throw some attention to them.
Yeah, both. Definitely attention and monetarily if your project is driving revenue. And I don't think you have to do that, but I think I would. Now, avoid strict negative tropes. I'd avoid strict tropes anyway, but you don't want your Arab traitor, or terrorist necessarily on your world. And now, it's not to say you don't have characters that aren't going to maybe resemble them, but don't make them more complex. Make them real people. Especially the people of the culture. Make them real. Don't cut them down into tropes and just throw it out there, because you're definitely going to catch someone's ire if someone besides you buys the work that you're working on. And the last thing I have to say on cultural appropriation here is get feedback from people, right? So before you actually launch the thing, you've developed the culture, especially if you can get a hold of someone in that culture, like the Indus Valley people, not going to get someone, from the Indus Valley civilization to be able to go over your work. That's what inspired you.
Unless you want to borrow one of my time machines.
But if there's one today, reach out on the internet, and see if someone's willing to look at your work, or get other sets of eyes on it, at least to make sure it's not, something that, is probably offensive. Unless this is what you're going for, in which case, good luck. This is a very hot topic in the industrial world. Now, to the second question, which is how do you create a fantasy culture inspired by a real world culture without mimicking it? This can be tough. And actually, I suggest to people, whether you're doing cultures or languages, you got to steal. Unless you're Tolkien, you're not writing a whole language on your own. Steal one, modify it, make it yours. But then when someone asks you, say, oh, that's based off of German. Like Bedrakum is completely based off of German. You can even tell by the length of some of the words in the language. It's very much, a root noun with a bunch of adjectives and modifiers pounded into one word. But especially when you're starting off with cultures, it's hard to take a color, a landscape and moon and make a whole culture out of. It's easier to look at how cultures actually have existed on Earth And when you start off, really just steal a culture and just start trying to figure out certain things about it. Just don't use it for your world, just as sort of like a practice run, right? Because there's a few things that I think are really valuable that you want to look for. But the biggest thing is, do not look for the details. That's where it's going to become mimicry. If they have the exact same holy symbols, if they have the exact same things that maybe have a different name, it starts to become mimicry at that point. And really, the human mind doesn't remember things based off of details anyway. We think we do. We think we look at a picture, and we think we can see that picture in our mind, and we believe that's the same picture we saw. But that's not, human minds work off of patterns. So look into certain areas for patterns that inspire you, that are repeated a lot, to develop certain things. First off, where do they come from? If you have a culture that is based off of a human culture, if the environment they live in isn't similar, like if you put a woodlands culture in a desert somewhere and don't change it, it's not going to make sense. It's not going to feel real to people. It's going to feel out of place. And people might not even recognize why, but it's not going to feel right. But you really have to be considerate. Like if this is a temperate woodland culture, there are certain types of activities that, whether you're in North America or Asia or Europe, that are going to be common in those specific types of cultures. And also, what are the resources available to the culture that they took advantage of? Because this is going to tell you the kind of resources you're going to need around where you are, whether it be iron or copper or bison or whatever it is. But what are the important resources around them? And on top of that, remember, I like to say food is a foundation of culture. Because when people get really localized, they start eating the same things. They start figuring out how to eat new things and how to grow and acquire new things. So food is a very foundational thing. What are the types of things, especially early on, do the culture eat? What type of grain, what type of meats, what type of vegetables, whether it's seafood or if it, is it land mammals, what do they eat? If you start changing a lot about the way they eat, I don't know if people will catch that one as much, but if you have a seafood-based culture and you place them in the middle of land and you don't change their eating habits, people are going to wonder, where do they get all the fish?
There's this underground river and it's straight out of the ocean. It comes right up in this well. It's fantastic.
I take the Maine coast, the people who live in Maine coast, and I create an alt earth and I put them in the middle of Iowa. The lobster eating is going to go down.
Yeah, a little bit.
And really where I start really looking for the patterns, though, is in the beliefs. What are the shapes of their homes? How do they build their homes? Do they orientate them in a certain direction, or are there villages, or do they have certain constructs in their villages that get put in certain directions? Do they worship ancestors? Most earlier cultures have some form of ancestor worship. But in ones where it's not so important, it does kind of fade away over time, or it changes the way they, like in Western culture today, you don't think we have ancestor worship, but, we have lots of things where we think back and remember people who've died. Not to the same degree as probably we did in the Stone Age, but it's still something that is intrinsically part of us. But, look for those core beliefs, look at their homes. Do they get tall? Are they really wide? Did they go down? These are all the types of patterns that intrigue me. These build the beliefs, which is what religion comes from, which is what the way the society acts towards each other. You go back to like the Republican Rome, or you go back to the democracy in Athens. They were very much about the state. If you were a Roman, you were about the Roman state first, and you weren't supposed to put yourself over the state. In Athens, it was so extreme that they even limited the amount of money you could spend on a funeral, because they didn't want you to shine too much. Because
that doesn't work in modern society, not modern America.
No, it does not work at all.
Sky's the limit.
And sometimes they crack down on people that were too ostentatious, and their cultures, because the thing was. And now, it's not to say that individualism didn't poke through. Most of the Roman civil wars were based off of the egos of people who thought they could be emperor. But, the cultural belief was the state came first, and you could grow by serving the state. So service to the state was like the greatest thing. If you were a wealthy merchant who didn't do anything for the state in Rome, you were a nobody. You would never get in the Senate. You would never be a person of real status in the country. Now, you'd have a really big home, but in the country, you would not have a lot of respect. Modern day America, that might not be so true. Warren Buffett probably has a lot more respect than most politicians. So, and that's just a difference in our cultural beliefs.
Yeah, that is kind of an unfortunate truth.
Well, I don't know what's necessarily better or worse. In a way, I'm a person that's about the individual, but I think it's also about individual interactions and how we carry ourselves. And some people don't carry themselves well, whether they're a millionaire or they're in my pay spectrum. But the thing I like to look at though is I try and find the patterns, the ones that interest me from that culture. When I was building the Bedrachum, one of the things that I liked about the way the Germans developed, was this idea of the organized state. And so I try to play off of what would that look like earlier. We don't have a lot of real records about like Germanic peoples back in the Iron Age, except the writings from Romans. But how do you go from like the barbarian hordes that Rome feared to the engineering people with very specific words today. And that's one of the themes I try and explore in the culture. But these are kind of things when you research the culture you can pull out. And all you're really doing at this point is you're pulling out the patterns that are interesting to you, but not the details, not the architecture. Some of it will grow along if they're in a similar environment. If you're in a area that has lots of trees and lots of stone, you're going to have stone and wood into the architecture. It might not look the same. Now, the other thing I like to look at too is how does the society start to structure itself when it evolves over time. So, it's like, do they have a merchant class? Do they have a priest class? Who was the leader of the society? Was it a theocracy, like a god king, or was it like a republic? Which a lot of the tribes typically are very republic based, but a lot of times when they convert over to civilization, they might get a god king instead of retaining some of the early voting that kind of went on. At least it was, and when I say republic or democracy, it's a very much of a loose term because it was like everyone got a vote. But for the people who did, now the other thing I like to look at too is what is the technology they have, at least in the era that you want to use them in. Like what was the types of technologies they used? You're going to want them in a somewhat similar place if they're in a similar time frame on your world. But now once you've pulled out all of those details, you have to apply your world to it. So you have to take the patterns for your world and start going back through there. You have to find the area that makes sense to hold a culture like that. But then what are the differences, right? Like where the Bedrachum live, there isn't all of the Europe around it that there is in our world. So they don't have a lot of the influences from other peoples. So they don't get a lot of the benefits of the cross-cultural pollination. Mainly because I don't have the time to make all of the cultures. But, they're not going to be affected as much by their neighbors because they're going to look at their neighbors as the same type of people as they are. How does magic affect it? What technology do they not necessarily need to develop? Maybe they figure out how to make pottery using magic, and they never figured out how to make the kilns to cook the pottery. They just use magic to do it. And a lot of that also, would depend on how strong magic is in your world, because maybe you have the ability to do that, but you still have to figure out the other technique because not enough people, or it takes too much energy to do. So you maybe have the technology and the magic, but sometimes the magic might displace the technology, or it might displace the concern over finding food. If you can have a spell called create food, are you worried about farming? Probably not. And are there any extra technologies you want? Are there any missing technologies or things that you want to get rid of? So what do you want to add in that they don't have, and how do you explain that they have it? And it's probably going to be from your world. Maybe there's a different type of resource available there that wasn't available where the culture grew up on Earth. And then the colors of the area. This is another thing I like to think about too a lot when I developing cultures are colors. Typically early on, the colors that are going to attract to people are colors that help camouflage them. Unless they're a high and noble, in which case they typically depends on the culture, but typically they want to stick out. So, what are the colors, that are important to them? And a lot of times for noble status, it's not things that are easily made. It's things you have to import. So if you have to import purple, purple becomes important. If everyone had purple, purple would not be an important color in modern day Europe. In general, that's kind of why I like to look at when I'm building a culture from an earth culture, is I like to look for patterns that interest me. But then I look at my world and I start developing the history of my world. And when I extrapolate it out, the cultures are definitely related. And for Gardul, it's a common ancestor, right? It's an actual Indo-European language. So it's derived from an Indo-European language. So there's a much stronger connection to Earth than maybe some other fantasy worlds will have. But because they were connected at a point previous, in those Atlantean days maybe. But
do you have any recommendations if somebody should be going through their world and realize that they do have a pretty cookie cutter culture or race or whatever, like something that they can do to kind of pull it back and prevent themselves from getting themselves into trouble?
Well, the thing is, it depends on how far along you are in your work, obviously. Like if you're creating a novel and you're like 90% done, I would reevaluate to say, does it make sense for my world? That's always the first thing I run into. And the problem is, no matter what you do, there's always going to be someone who calls your work derivative. There's always going to be someone who says you're culturally appropriated if you are successful in getting it into the hands of people. But just look and say, if it's not, what can I do to shadow it? And in ways, someone will say it to you, and then you read their book about a knight on a quest. Where would you draw the line? To me, it's like, if your cathedrals, are cathedrals, exactly the same as they would be in this period of time on Earth, you're starting to approach mimicry. If the architecture is the same, if the art's the same, but if you start with the details that interest you and take the patterns and apply it to your world, maybe they're not at war as much. So maybe the importance of the warrior starts to go away, especially if they're not a society based on tradition. A society where tradition is really important. It's like, in Japan today, you have so many people who study the path of Bushido, even though, I don't know if their militaries had an action outside of Japan. If so, in a very limited fashion since the end of World War II. So even though, so that's why it's kind of important to understand the core beliefs of a culture, but how are they impacted by the stimulus of your world on it? And if you allow your world in, it will help diffuse it. And so if you, like Michael says, you get into that position where you're stuck, because this seems too derivative, have you applied enough of your world and really thought your world through and the effect of your world on it? If you have giant boss monsters roaming around your world, that's going to have a huge impact on the culture in the area, right? You have one of those giant monsters from Final Fantasy VII. The fact that they exist.
I was going to go with Shadow of the Colossus.
Shadow of the Colossus would, be another one, because that's like story intricate, where the ones in Final Fantasy were more like just sort of this bogus thing added in.
Not always. A lot of the big ones at the end of the stories were always story.
No, I'm not talking about like those, like the giant, like
monsters. Oh, you're just talking about like your like random encounters where you have a pretty large thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got you.
But when you got those kind of things, they're going to have a huge impact. If you still have dinosaurs on your planet, in the oceans, let's say, like those giant like shark and whale things that used to be on Earth, it's going to have a huge impact on coastal cultures.
What do you mean used to be?
Well, as far as we know.
They're still out there.
Well, just not as big. At least the ones that we know about.
Yeah, they are.
Except for maybe the squid, which we don't know enough about. But yeah, you don't have like the Megatron or whatever it's called.
Megalodon.
Oh, Megalodon. Did I get the name wrong?
Megatron.
That would be cool.
Megatron.
If Megatron exists in your world,
cruising the oceans.
If Megatron exists in your world, that will affect the culture that lives by Megatron. Because he's a force of nature. Let's be honest. Cobra, not so much. It'll have no real cultural impact on your world, but Megatron would. No, Cobra.
Come on. Cobra!
The only thing that they would be good at.
There's 2 people listening that got that reference.
Well, the only thing that they'd be good at is jumping out just in time.
To be older, yeah.
Yeah. No, they've remade like movies recently. I haven't seen them.
Yeah, not with that voice though. That voice.
Oh, the old Cobra Commander.
Yeah, the old Cobra Commander voice.
To give it away to the people who didn't know what he was coming from.
Exactly.
But really, it's about looking at it through the lens of your world. And if you do that, you will run into those circumstances less. But sometimes you might want to break the rule. I have a very Roman-like society on my world. Like very, like they didn't evolve the same, but they obviously have a common thread. And actually, my friend Matt has a culture on his world that's very much the same way, and this was structured this way on purpose. But it ties into the mythology of the world and the reason why that culture exists. So I mean. It depends on what you're trying to get to. So someone looking at the Shiftarian culture could definitely go, that's very much derivative. And I'd have to take it because it is. It's sort of the Republican side of it was very similar. It deviated from that point, but there was a common thread between their world and my world, which held on. And now, maybe I'll release that someday. But
now the question is, did you create that culture when you originally created Gardual as copying the Romans? Because I know you love Roman culture. Or did it just so happen that it ended up that way?
No, this was purposeful.
By design.
This was.
But I mean, did you say, I really love the Roman culture and I want a Roman style thing in my world?
It depends on what you make. The Romans make interesting neighbors. If you don't
that's one way to put it. Interesting.
So the thing is the culture has intrigued me. I wouldn't necessarily say I like them. They were kind of jerks.
Well, you know what I mean. Like as a student of history, they're an interesting culture. Like the Romans are we know a
lot about them, and they had a huge impact. Even
exactly. Almost you can't be a studier of history without knowing something about the Roman culture.
Yes, and I did that because a lot of people know about them, so it gives me something to ground with people that, especially Western people, would have some idea of. But there's actually a story reason to it, and essentially there were actually not 2 brothers. They were not twins. There were 4 brothers, and 2 of them were on Earth. One went to Gardual, and one went to Polivia.
Oh.
And so the foundation, the entire belief structure is the same, but the Pelagian culture lived in a more Polynesian style world, where mine lived in a kind of a similar circumstance, but still different. Because there's definitely a British influence because they're on an island instead of on a peninsula. But so there are deviations that start, but the core idea of gravitas and and the social structure is exactly the same, but on purpose. All right, so that is it for the day.
No.
Yes, that is it.
No.
Well, for the main content of the show.
All right, so what's the world builder task?
Create an inspired culture, one you've taken from, and fit it into your world.
Actually, I should have done that because the next one you should do.
The next one I should do.
Just do them both. I'll just kick back.
You'll just kick back this time.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll be your supportive partner.
Because Mike's worried about this. He's worried that you might be stuck in your world building.
I don't want anyone to be stuck.
Go to garduel.com/start. It'll redirect you to the website where you can sign up for that, which is like howtoworldbuild.com. I know, huh? Who knew I could have bought that one? If I could have bought that, if I knew about that one years ago, I would have bought it years ago. But
it's kind of off-brand.
But just go to Garduel. I know, huh? Garduel.com, GARDUL.com/start, and it will redirect you right to this page where you can sign up for free, absolutely no cost. And then I'll show you how simple world building really is. Because also, too, if you're like someone like me who world builds a lot, you make it really complicated. And that's part of the problem. And so just go ahead, go to garduel.com/start, sign up right now, and I'll give you the course for free. It's simple. It's like only going to be a couple hours of your time. It'll be completely worth it if you're either stuck or you're afraid to start. Either one, just go there and get it taken care of. So until next week, have a wonderful time.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil.
We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends.
And so would they.
If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting.
Take them to Stitcher or iTunes, or best of all, just send them to our website, www.garduel.com.
That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.